We welcome you back to Tour With Us Tuesdays, and we have entered into the 20th century. And as we move into that 20th century, there are some things we want you to be mindful of. How do things change? When we talk about changing centuries, you know, when we went into the 21st century, we were worried about Y2K. Well, going into the 20th century was really no different than a lot of our ancestors might have been thinking about. As we were going into 1900, 1910, and as we move forward, what are the big things that they're seeing and the big changes? One, transportation. We talked about the train. Well, just, you know, about 15 years, less than 15 years into the 20th century, the Wright brothers are flying. Can you imagine seeing and hearing those new technologies? The other thing is advances in medicine. So certainly we face today COVID-19. Well, in the early 20th century, we had the influenza outbreak of 1918, and we know that that impacted this area. And we know who was on the front lines? The public health led by Dr. Cox, who was working to quarantine and protect the community, not just during the influenza epidemic, but about 15 years earlier, a smallpox outbreak in the 20th century. So advances in transportation, advances in medicine, and advances in communication. We all live, you know, mine's in my pocket right now, my cell phone. Can you imagine knowing that your neighbor had a telephone and that you could reach your neighbor just by picking up that very odd looking device? And now we're so connected, but all of these big changes. Now, certainly with big change is also frequently lots of conflict and turmoil. People don't always accept change or don't quite understand it readily. There are also worldwide conflicts that we must be addressing at this time period. In our case, we talk a little bit here about World War I, and again, bringing the world, this new world, to our doorsteps. You know, so much of Onslow County was about farming and fishing and working in kind of the rural settings of the county. Imagine being a young farmhand, you know, 17, 18, 19 years old. You've never been more than a few miles from home, and suddenly you're on a ship and you're sailing across the Atlantic to France. Well, that is going to dramatically change your worldview. And so we turn to the 20th century and begin to see things sort of speed up. And time really sort of speeds up. We move from the conflict of World War I and facing a pandemic then. And then by the 1920s, we began to see some new changes. We began to see changes in economics. And unfortunately, that would result in the Great Depression of 1929. So what does that mean? So here at the Onslow County Museum, we know the factors that led to the Great Depression, but we wanted to know how families responded directly. So we did a lot of oral history interviews with folks who had lived through the Great Depression. And some folks said, you know what? Depression? What depression? Our family never had any money. Maybe they were sharecroppers, or it was just, you know, making ends meet the best they could. And that's what they said. So long as they could feed their family, they could work their farm, then they felt relatively secure, even in the midst of the Depression. But this was a period of great economic distress. In the state of North Carolina, we should point out that we had our governor, Max Gardner, and he wanted to make sure that children stayed in school. That sounds something like we've all been talking about. But what he did is he abbreviated the school year and made sure that children could go to school for a few months even when other schools around the country were closing in the Great Depression. And so there were efforts made, but to make sure that children could go to school just for that limited time period. Other things were banks were closing. Well, we spoke with one individual who lived here in Richlands during the Great Depression, and even again, when banks were closing around us, the trustees of the bank actually put their own money into the bank repository so that it would remain fluid and never closed, so that people still had access to that support. So we have this Great Depression, still fishing, still farming, still building boats, still pulling timber from the forest, but things were pretty bleak. And then suddenly we begin to hear the rumblings of war in Europe. And we're watching what's happened very slowly. The insidious, quiet sometimes behavior of Hitler as he begins creeping into those European countries. And it begins first as rumors, and then those rumblings get louder and louder. And then certainly on December 7th, 1941, the attacks on Pearl Harbor would push the United States into World War II. As we are thrust again onto the world stage, what does that mean locally? Well, because we were hearing those rumblings, the Department of War was making preparations. Here in Onslow County, we saw that in two very dramatic ways and places. First and foremost was the construction of an anti-aircraft training base at Camp Davis in Holly Ridge. Lots of folks are a little bit unfamiliar with that because that base is no longer here. However, there are vestiges and reminders of that, and many families who remember when the Army was here in Onslow County at Camp Davis. And certainly in the spring of 1941, when the United States Marine Corps came to town and acquired initially 111,000 acres. So why this place? Well, that's been a topic of discussion here for many, many years. And there were several factors that led to the location of what would become known as Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune here in Onslow County. First and foremost, its proximity to the ocean. We talked about the water and the wood and the native peoples, the early settlers, the economy that's based on geography. Not so different with the Marine Corps. They needed this type of landscape in order to train Marines and sailors. Secondly, there was an important report written in 1940 by a man named Mr. George Gillette. Mr. Gillette was with the Army Corps of Engineers. He actually was from here in Onslow County, and he wrote a white paper about the unguarded coast, meaning from Norfolk, Virginia to Charleston, South Carolina, there was not a significant line of defense and the need for that. Finally, we also had our Congressman, Graham Barton, who represented the 3rd District. Congressman Barton also was very supportive of locating a military installation here in this vicinity. All of that, coupled with the community's sense of patriotism, although it was not always easy to make this decision, and sometimes people, farms were not willingly sold. We had more than 740 families relocated for the construction of Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune. Now, that will forever change and shape who we are. The entire world comes here to Onslow County in the midst of World War II. And it will forever change who we are, but not in a way that it is unrecognizable. It is one more layer, one more feature of who we are. Bringing the Marine Corps here to Eastern North Carolina also meant dramatic changes in other ways. First and foremost, this was a site in which the very first African American Marines would be trained, our Montford Point Marines. Also, this is the site where the first women Marines would be trained. More than 20,000 African American men 19,000 women came here to this place, again, to change, to contribute to the military might that would be represented in World War II. And Onslow County would, in fact, boom in the midst of World War II, forever changing, shaping who we are, and making us a microcosm of the world. The whole world lives here in Onslow County. When we look around, we can see the diversity, the sense of inclusion, and it begins in this moment.